As Dean Turnbull mentioned, I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker this afternoon, the Honorable Andrew Swan, who will be speaking to us on the role of the Minister of Justice and the role of the Attorney General. Here at Robson Hall, our focus is almost exclusively on the courts of justice, almost exclusively on case law. And I think this is inevitably so. But that focus shouldn't lead one to think that the courts are the exclusive protector of the rule of law. In fact, there remain many officials across the public sector who play that role in protecting the rule of law, not the least of which is the Attorney General. The role of the Attorney General dates back historically to, I think it's the 13th century in England. And here in Canada, that role was assumed pre-Confederation by attorneys general who were appointed to the provinces of Canada. And so the Attorney General role and the Minister of Justice role that we see here in this country actually has quite an historical grounding. I think the importance of the role of the Attorney General can be seen not just here at home, but also on the international front. I think, for example, as I'm sure you do as well, of the role that Lord Goldsmith has played in the United Kingdom's invasion into Iraq. And while one might contest whether that invasion was legal according to international norms, and we know that the likes of the late and great Lord Bingham contest the legality according to international law. The importance that the Blair government placed upon Attorney General Lord Goldsmith's advice about the legality of that invasion, I think brings home to us some of the significance of the role of the Attorney General. And here at home, we see, for example, in the build-up to the polygamy reference in British Columbia, the role that the former Attorney General Wally Opal played leading up to that constitutional reference being established. All of which leads us to our distinguished speaker this afternoon. And certainly he will have much to engage us given his significant public experience. He was first elected as an MLA for Minto in the 2004 by-election and was re-elected in the 2007 provincial election. He is a born and raised Winnipegger, graduating from Silver Heights Collegiate, attending university here on campus, and graduating from Robson Hall in 1990. And that means, because he became Attorney General almost a year ago to the day, that it took him less than a score of years to graduate from Robson Hall and be Attorney General. And I guess our question to him is, why did it ever take that long? Our distinguished speaker practiced law at Thompson Dorfman Swetman, primarily in family law. He was an active member of the Manitoba Bar Association, head of the Young Lawyers subsection of the MBA. He also lectured at Law Society courses for articling students. And as Attorney General, he's instituted a number of initiatives, also as Minister of Justice, including efforts to reduce crime, particularly gang crime, efforts to enhance services for the delivery of family law services in the public sector. He, as I mentioned, has experienced firsthand the role for almost a year, so he will have much to share with us on the subject. Before I ask and turn to the Honourable Andrew Swan, just want to set out a little bit of our order here. First of all, Mr. Swan will speak to us. The organizers have asked myself to lend a few comments on the role of the Attorney General at the federal level. And they have asked me that because I served a number of ministers of justice, not only at the provincial level, but also at the federal level. So I'll be highlighting 2 or 3 distinctions. And then it's your turn. We'll open up the floor for questions. So without further ado, I give you the Honourable Andrew Swan.
Well, thank you, Dawn, and thank you, Lorna. And it's a pleasure to be here in my old law school. It's a little bit intimidating when I found out that the last distinguished visitor was a Supreme Court judge. So I fear I'm going to take the level down just a little bit. It's kind of interesting that the moot courtroom, I'm still physically challenged by it. When I was a student, when I was here, we didn't have smart classrooms. We had dumb classrooms. And we had just those little sort of writing pieces that came out. And I'm left-handed. So being left-handed, I always had trouble taking notes in here. I'm also a little bit tall, as you've noticed, and I'm not sure how I would get in and out of these seats if I was coming here on a regular basis. That's probably a good thing I got through law school when I did. As Donna has said, it is 20 years since I graduated from Robson Hall. My class from Robson Hall is actually having a little reunion on Saturday night. There's about 40 of us that are going to get together, which is almost half of our class. And what I really thought was scary, which I told Professor Schwartz's class the other night, is that artifacts from my years here are now like in glass out in the hall, which is kind of a sign that time is moving on. One of the events out there was the coffee house that we had in my graduating year. And it's times like that I kind of reflect on the fact, first of all, how happy I am that YouTube didn't exist 20 years ago. And the other thinking, in 20 years, I'm not sure if there'll be any politicians that are going to be able to stand up here as the Attorney General, because if you left a trail of video and other evidence, I'm not sure what impact that's going to have, and that'll be something interesting to watch in the future. So I'm here to talk about the role of the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice, which, to put it simply, are 2 very separate and distinct roles, which are all supposed to take place inside my brain at any given time. And the 2 of them are in addition to some of the other roles I have as an elected official. First and foremost, I'm a member of the legislature. I represent Minto, which is the west central area of Winnipeg, Ellis Avenue, Sargent Avenue. It extends all the way from Balmoral Street all the way out to St. James Street. So a very transitional area in Winnipeg. 1 in every 3 people that I represent was born outside of Canada. Obviously an area with some real challenges, especially the Spence area, does have crime issues, does have gang issues, and of course as a representative and now as the Minister of Justice, it means that people expect me to have something to say all the time on these issues, which is their right. The 2 main roles I have, though, of course, is the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General. And as Donna has said, the Attorney General has a very long history of effectively being the senior law officer for the province. So the Attorney General is completely nonpartisan. The Attorney General's job is to effectively manage a balanced justice system, and also to make sure that wrongdoing, wherever it is, whatever happens, is treated appropriately. The Attorney General is separate and apart and actually doesn't really take direction from the Premier, doesn't take direction from other cabinet colleagues, doesn't really take direction from anybody in a very odd sense. It's a nonpartisan role which most people would agree in our system is absolutely necessary. Now, the other side of my brain then is the Minister of Justice. The Minister of Justice is a member of Cabinet. The Minister of Justice is an entirely partisan type who wants his government to be re-elected, so he or she can hopefully remain in Cabinet. And it's a position that does actively deal with cabinet, seek direction, put forward initiatives. And as I'll explain, there's a couple of ways that those different roles can actually come into conflict. I should mention, and as Donna said, it's about a year ago I was appointed. When you become the Minister of Justice, in fact, when you become any cabinet minister, there's no playbook or manual that you get. Usually they'll have a briefing book that's ready to go, and your deputy minister, who's the senior non-political person who administers the department, comes in and gives you a little pep talk on exactly what it is and maybe the things you have to deal with that afternoon in your vast experience. There's no real manual. There is a memo that gets prepared in Manitoba for the new Attorney General. And of course, Bruce McFarlane, who was a deputy minister, did an earlier version of the memo that I got from my own deputy, Jeff Schnur, on my first day on the job, which reminds not only the difference between the role of the Attorney General and the role of the Minister of Justice, but also the pitfalls. And the fact that if I actively speak about a criminal case, that may be grounds for me to resign. If I reveal the name of a young offender, that definitely is grounds for me to resign, which is going to preface the fact that I may not be able to give the full and complete answer you may want to some of your questions. Although, as I hear, that didn't stop Justice McLaughlin from being very provocative in some of her comments the other week. But she's there for life. I don't get that same opportunity. So let me talk first of all about what I don't do. Because when I go out and talk to anybody, here I'm in a sophisticated audience. Not all audiences are quite as sophisticated. I love going into schools in my area. I love going into schools anywhere in the province and talking about government and talking about why it's important that people are engaged. And of course, students want to know what exactly is it that you do. People on the street want to know what it is that I do and why don't I do this? And oftentimes it takes a little bit of explaining as to what I can and can't do. I joked last year, my first year as a minister, there was one day when I had a lovely day of social activities with groups that I really had no control over. In the afternoon, the RCMP invited me to come to a gathering at D Division, which is at Portage and Dominion. And I thought about that. I said, well, there's the police. The RCMP are the provincial police force. Of course, we provide the legislative framework. And of course, in Winnipeg and Brandon and some other communities, we provide those municipalities with money to hire police officers. We're certainly interested in how they get trained. But I don't actually tell the police how to do their job. When a crime occurs, which unfortunately does happen in this province, I don't show up at the crime scene and start looking over the police officer's shoulders and tell them what to do. I don't tell them who to investigate or what to investigate or what they should be doing. Similarly, of course, I'm responsible, notionally, for our entire prosecution system. We have Crown attorneys in the Department of Justice, and their job is to decide whether, and to give opinions to the police on whether they should charge people, on whether to proceed with prosecutions, whether to abandon them, whether to stay charges, whether to seek, for example, adult penalties for young offenders in certain cases. Those are all very serious decisions. And although I guide them through general policies, I don't actually tell any prosecutor who to investigate or not to investigate. You can find a lot of the policies online. For example, there's a policy on gun crimes. There's a policy on the gun registry. There's a policy on hate crimes. There's a policy on impaired driving, which gives a little bit of direction and some general ideas on how we want our Crown prosecutors to be prosecuting certain kinds of cases. But the idea that as an Attorney General, I would ever actually direct a Crown attorney to recommend charging somebody or to recommend staying charges is pretty scary. Because once an Attorney General in Manitoba or anywhere else makes that leap, isn't that really the first step to a pretty scary police state? Because even though the Attorney General says, well, I'm just doing this because of the public interest, because everybody's really concerned about this and we don't want to stay those charges, as soon as the Attorney General steps out of that role of being the senior law officer and starts to take not even a partisan, but even a publicly popular approach, well then isn't it very easy for the following Attorney General to start directing at certain people that maybe didn't take the right kind of lawn sign? Or the individual who belongs to a special interest group that protested against the government? That's a real danger, that if you're not scrupulously careful about what happens, you can start down a very slippery slope that thankfully in our wonderful country, in our great province, we don't have to worry about. But those are things as the Attorney General you've got to keep in mind. The other piece, of course, is judges. Judges are fiercely independent. If you search my name in the Queen's Bench records, you'll see there's exactly one lawsuit pending against me, and it was filed by my friends on the provincial court. Judges are very independent, and they take that seriously. The lawsuit, just before you go and run and look it up, has been filed by the Provincial Judges Association, who were unhappy with the legislature. There's a two-step process for how judges get compensated. There is a standard way that judges' new salaries are determined based on an average of how much they get paid in Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia, kind of our closest brethren in terms of size and population. And then there was a recommendation for increases for the following 2 years. The legislature, all parties, decided they couldn't really accept that, and they allowed the basic amount, but didn't allow the increases as the judges had wanted. So the judges are suing me. I'm still friends with them. We still talk about issues, but they're very independent. And as I think you know, as the Attorney General, I don't tell judges how to decide cases. And I've got to be very careful not to suggest to anybody else how a judge should decide a particular case, even though I'm invited many times by the opposition, I'm invited by the media, or even invited by somebody on the street, or sometimes even my family members, that I should just tell that judge, this is not acceptable. Why aren't you doing this? Well, of course, as the Attorney General, you don't do that. And again, it's a very scary precedent to think that an Attorney General ever would have any influence over how a judge decides a case. We truly do have a complete separation of the executive and the judiciary, and although sometimes there may be people who wonder why that's the case, it's actually a very, very fundamental principle of how our legal system operates. So if I don't control the police, and I don't control the Crown attorneys, and I don't control the judges, you may then ask, what is it exactly that I do? Well, on the police side, of course, we want to make sure they have the appropriate training and the appropriate resources, the appropriate legislative framework to do their job. For Crown attorneys, our job is to make sure that they have the resources they need, they have the support they need. That's why we've been adding Crown attorneys, and that's why there's going to be lots of jobs for any of you who want to come and join the Crown. We'll be hiring 53 more Crown attorneys over the next 6 years, in addition to the Crowns that we hire on a regular basis to replace those who retire, who move on, or who we appoint to the bench, as happened and we'll be celebrating tomorrow. So we want to make sure that is there for Crown attorneys. I'm also responsible for the correction system. The correction system, of course, is our provincial jail system. We have a number of jails, Headingley Correctional Centre, the Winnipeg Remand Centre, Milner Ridge, Brandon, the Paw. There's a very old, decrepit women's jail at Portage la Prairie, which thankfully is being replaced. That can't happen soon enough. That'll be out near Headingley, the new jail. There's also 2 youth facilities, one at the Manitoba Youth Centre down Kenniston Boulevard, and a larger facility out in Portage called the Agassiz Correctional Centre, as well as the Winnipeg Remand Centre. So I'm responsible for those. I'm responsible for the safety of the jail guards and the inmates in that system. I'm responsible for probation officers within the correction system, whose job it is to help people in the community who may have conditions of bail or probation that have been put upon them, to try and get them to work within that order, and if it doesn't happen, then to make the decision to go and breach that person and have further proceedings taken against them. I'm also responsible for making sure our court system runs smoothly. Although I don't tell the judges what to do, I do try to help out our court clerks, our sheriff's officers who take people to and from jails to court proceedings, provide security in courthouses, and a bunch of other things. I'm responsible as the Minister for the Public Trustee's Office. Public Trustee takes on estates and other things for people who are not competent to manage their own affairs. When there isn't a family member that's able to do it, or perhaps there's a few family members who tend to point fingers at each other and don't want anybody else to have control over their aunt or their mother or their father's money. The legal aid system is also something that's funded largely by the provincial government. The legal aid is an independent board which reports to me, though, and we try to provide services and assistance for legal aid. So there's a whole bunch of areas that that I'm responsible for, and again, I always have to think of this diversity, the dichotomy between being the Attorney General and the Minister of Justice. If you ask the Attorney General, who at least is half here with you today, what is your mission statement? What's your job? The Attorney General would probably simply say, well, my job is to make sure that we have a reasonable, balanced, fair legal system in the province of Manitoba. And if you asked an Attorney General in any other Canadian province, any other Commonwealth country, you'd probably get a very similar answer. The Minister of Justice's answer, I'd suggest to you, is quite a bit different. My job is to try and improve public safety. My job is to prevent crime. My job is to try and make people feel safer in their own communities, in their own neighborhoods, in their own homes, when they're driving on the streets. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can accomplish that. And that's the political reality. Different people and different groups will have different views on how you actually fulfill your role as the Minister of Justice. And that, I think, was highlighted pretty clearly during the civic election that was just determined on Wednesday. There was a very, very perplexing poll that came out. And they asked Winnipeggers, well, what's the best approach to dealing with crime? And about half of the respondents said they favored a traditional tough on crime approach, which usually deals with what happens after the crime's been committed. What are the penalties going to be? What should the bail conditions be? What should probation services do? The other half of Winnipeggers said, well, no, the best way to do this is actually to be tougher on the root causes of crime. We need more recreation. We need more opportunities. We need more people finishing high school and going on to university or college or apprenticeship systems. And, of course, you generally see those two as being on either side of the political spectrum. But as the Minister of Justice, the suggestion I have is that you don't have to choose one or the other. Why can't you do both? And in Manitoba, we've actually been very active at working with our federal government and working within our own control, because of course we can't make criminal law, to find ways to be tough on crime, that there's meaningful consequences. But at the same time, we've also worked not just within the Department of Justice, but with all of my other cabinet colleagues as the Justice Minister to try and find more ways to prevent crime. So I'll talk a little bit about that and then some of the hot button issues that may have been raised over the past while before we get on to questions I know you're going to have about what it is that we do. So in terms of getting tough on crime, again, there's some different ways to address that. There are some, including sometimes my political opponents, that don't think we should really do anything as a government, and I shouldn't do anything as a Minister of Justice until a crime's been committed, until there actually is a victim, until there is an offender, until there's damage, there's loss in the community. And there's lots of ideas on how to get really tough once that's happened. And yeah, you got to have tough penalties. And Manitoba, I'm telling you, and actually Bruce McFarlane is one of the major architects of this, Manitoba has been the most clear, compelling voice in the past decade at calling on our federal government to pass meaningful laws to take on organized crime, to take on some of the really dangerous people that cause damage to our communities. Of course, as the province, we can only ask the federal government. We don't make criminal law. If we do make criminal law, what's going to happen? It's going to get struck down. I'm also the minister responsible for constitutional affairs, and my job is to make sure that any laws that we pass are constitutional, that they're within Manitoba's control. But I'll point out some of the things that we've been successful in lobbying the federal government to change. We believe there should be tougher penalties for criminal harassment, for people who stalk others, who threaten them. We know that stalking in many cases is a precursor to a murder. And the federal government listened to Manitoba and made that change. We've had an entire package of reforms, 14 recommendations actually that came out of the work that officials in the Manitoba's Department of Justice took on how we can deal with organized crime. And because of those efforts, the federal government's agreed with us. There's now tougher penalties for gang-related crimes, tougher penalties for gun crimes, for things like drive-by shootings, which we think are very, very useful. We are also a loud voice, and this is where it's the Minister of Justice as opposed to the Attorney General, because the Attorney General's off doing his thing. The Minister of Justice is focused on these issues. We were the first province to call on the federal government to change the existing system, which provides a 2-for-1 credit for time served on remand. You'll never find that in a law. It was just simply the practice that judges began providing, is that if you were sitting on remand, the idea was, well, remand's kind of tougher than regular jail time because you're innocent until proven guilty, so we'll just give you double time for any time you spent. There was a growing sense across the country that that wasn't actually encouraging people on remand to take responsibility, if indeed they had done it. If not, we want people to get on and have their day in court as soon as possible. We called on the federal government to do that, and we're actually quite pleased they did that. As the Minister of Justice, also responsible for the corrections system, that poses some challenges in our crowded jails, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We also called on the federal government to improve the Youth Criminal Justice Act. The Youth Criminal Justice Act replaced the Young Offenders Act last decade and created some, in our view, some situations that didn't give people a lot of confidence in our system. And in Manitoba, that manifested itself the worst with our car theft epidemic that occurred beginning in about 1993, reached its worst in about 2004, and although we've improved it greatly since then, continues to be a problem. And under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, as it now stands, many times judges have been unable, based on their interpretation of the law and by precedent, to hold youths who are truly out of control in custody. It's frustrating for police, it's frustrating for our Crown attorneys, and it's frustrating for everybody who gets their car stolen, or worse, has a family member or a friend injured or killed by somebody who's stolen a car and driving it without concern for others. We've called on the federal government to make improvements. The federal government introduced amendments earlier this year which did some of the things we wanted to do, and actually, although nobody ever believes me when I tell them this, actually makes the system weaker in terms of trying to control kids who, for whatever reason, are out of control and are likely to go out and commit crimes again. So we think there's more work to do on that front, but we'll continue to be a loud voice on that front. We've also called on the federal government very recently to take stronger measures to deal with people who commit home invasions. Again, that's a terrifying crime for somebody to all of a sudden have someone breaking into their house while they're home, to deal with carjackings, and to deal with premeditated knife crimes. The point being that if you take a knife into a store and plan to use it to commit a robbery, we think that should be an aggravating factor. If you use a knife to injure or kill a cab driver, which happens in this country too often, that should be an aggravating factor. And we continue to work on the federal government on the get tough side. And that's important. That's really important, but it's not the whole picture. And not to be overly partisan, but that's where some of my political opponents figure that's all the Minister of Justice should do, and that's all a government should do. The other piece, of course, or pieces, are prevention. Trying to prevent people from getting into trouble in the first place. And that's where the Attorney General is quite prepared to go over and do what he wants to do. The Minister of Justice in Manitoba is one of the ministers that sits on the Healthy Child Committee of Cabinet. That's a cabinet committee that's fully staffed within government, comprised of 8 different government ministries. If I try to name them all I'll forget one or two, but it involves justice, family services, education, Aboriginal and Northern affairs, healthy living, and a couple more, to make sure we're not doing things in silos. Every time a kid drops out of high school, or every time a baby's born that has an FASD, or every time a child is apprehended, there's a greater chance that at some point they're going to wind up in the justice system. And one of the things that I can do is to be the justice minister, but at the same time to be one of these other ministers trying to find ways that we get better starts for young people in Manitoba, because if we do that, it's going to pay long-term dividends in terms of fewer people turning to crime. We've also pushed the envelope, and I'm sure Bruce would agree with this. We've pushed the envelope on things that we can do within provincial control on the justice front to try and take on some of the really difficult problems our communities are facing. An example of that was the Safer Community and Neighbourhoods Act, which was passed soon after our government came to power. It is a civil statute that gets criminal activity out of people's neighbourhoods. We don't do it by using the criminal standard. Many times the police will tell us that they can't get a warrant to go in and deal with a house, even though everybody in the whole town or the whole neighbourhood knows they're dealing drugs, or it's a booze can, or they know there's sexual exploitation taking place. The Safer Communities and Neighbourhoods Act allows a neighbour to make a confidential complaint. We have a provincial unit that does the investigation, gathers all the evidence, and then if they gather enough, we'll go to the landlord in many cases, or go to the property owner, present the evidence, and we then expect the landlord or the owner to take steps to move the people out. If that doesn't work, there's a court order that can be obtained, but that's actually rarely happened in Manitoba. So we've used the civil standard. Is it more reasonable than not that there's an illegal activity that's affecting the neighborhood? And by doing that, we've been able to shut down over 450 homes and apartments where illegal activities are taking place. Entirely within our control of property and civil rights. If there's enough evidence, our investigators turn it over to the police. There may be a criminal sanction that comes, but we've acted entirely within our own control. Another area where we're pushing the envelope is in the area of criminal forfeiture. There was a law passed several years ago. Bruce, you were still the deputy at the time. There was a law that was passed allowing the seizure of homes, of vehicles, of other property, if it's shown that somebody has been carrying on criminal activities. Again, using our control over property and civil rights in the Constitution. And the first go-around, the bill looked great. The police told us that although it was a nice bill, they were actually too busy doing their stuff, and that maybe we could improve it. We did that a couple of years ago and brought in a bill creating another provincial unit to carry on these activities. We've now been able to seize a number of houses that have been used as grow-ops. There's a bit of remediation to do. If you've ever been in a grow-op, I'm not expecting any of you have. After they've been remediated. It does a lot of damage, whether it's marijuana or whether it's a meth lab. The damage and the danger is great. We've been able to remediate those and actually sell them and use the money for crime-fighting initiatives, which is all helpful. There's some other things we've done, civil remedies to prevent criminal organizations from getting liquor licenses, in some cases from carrying on business, all things that we can do within our own control that give people more confidence that as a Manitoban, if something's going on that shouldn't, they've got an ability to step up, to be heard, and get results. And I'm pleased that we've been able to do that on a number of fronts. There's still some frustrations out there, but it is positive. And again, we've tried to move on these things by finding ways the government can actually help people. The former government actually brought in an earlier version of the Safer Communities Act. They had the genesis of the idea that, yeah, maybe you can use civil remedies to do this. At that time, the bill they brought in suggested if you had a neighbor who was probably a gang member who was selling drugs, you could go to court and you could go over and knock on their door and serve them with court order. We thought there was a few problems with that, and we thought it was actually better that the state take that on. and that if somebody has that kind of problem, they make their complaint, they get action, and then we move forward. You've probably heard about the successes in Point Douglas. You've probably heard about the Powerline program, which has dramatically reduced the danger in that community, moved out a lot of the drug houses. The Powerline program actually is just a better way to hook residents up with the Public Safety Investigation Unit, as well as a couple of other things. So those are things that you can actually do to make communities safer. Some of the challenges, obviously, as the Minister of Justice, is that I'm constrained. My opponent can stand up in question period and can demand, of course, that I tell the Crown Attorney that they had better appeal that case. And I see some of you frowning and shaking your heads. This does happen on a regular basis. My critic, who allegedly is also a graduate of this fine institution, will tell me that I have to direct my Crown Attorneys to appeal. Well, as you already know, the Attorney General doesn't do that. The Minister of Justice might like to, but the Attorney General is always that calming voice saying, no, if I start doing that, what's going to happen? What are the possible consequences? I'm also told from time to time that if there's a quasi-judicial board that's making a decision, that I should get there in front and I should phone the members of that board and tell them if they don't make the right decision, they're gone. I am not making this up. This is in the last year, since I've become minister, my critic has in the House and publicly in the hall suggested that I, as the Attorney General, should go and I should influence and direct what should happen. And it sounds good. It's a heck of a good soundbite. Tom Broadbeck loves that kind of stuff. But as the Attorney General and having that responsibility in the government, there's something more to it. And also protecting our system in addition, as well as protecting the safety of Manitobans is what the job is all about. Many times, I'll be asked to comment on cases. And I'll be asked to comment in the relative sanctity of question period where everybody's always at their best. And I'll be asked specifics about a case. It happens to the Minister of Health, too. It happens to the Minister of Family Services. We're asked about a case. Well, we have privacy laws, which mean that even though I may know some details about the victim of a crime, or I may know more details about the person that's accused of the crime, I certainly can't say them. And again, my response has to be, I'm sorry, I can't comment on that case. That's before the courts. You will see the media and sometimes the opposition saying, well, what's wrong with that Attorney General? Why isn't he commenting on this? This is important to people. People want to know what's going on. And of course, I'm not going to speak about the case because it's before the courts. And I cannot be seen as prejudging a case or trying to influence how that case is eventually determined. And to be honest, it can be a frustrating place to be. There are times when I know a lot more facts. Sometimes the health minister feels the same way, and sometimes the family services minister feels the same way. When you're in government, of course, you're effectively the keeper of a lot of that information, and you simply can't go because you think it's politically expedient on a given day or at a given hour to spill some information. And that's what makes this job, or these two jobs, very interesting. So what else do I need to tell you before you pepper me with questions, many of which I'll tell you I can't answer because it's before the courts? Maybe that's about all we need to. What are the challenges? Again, as I've said, the Justice Minister deals with the tip of the iceberg. Right? I deal with people who've been in crisis, people who may have come from poverty, people who may have been abused, and sometimes people who are just jerks. But many times there's underlying problems and underlying reasons why people have been become involved in criminal activity. And yes, there's got to be meaningful consequences. Again, if we talk meaningful consequences, the opposition believes there's only one meaningful consequence if you commit a crime, and that's going to jail. Jail can be a meaningful consequence. Jail is necessary for people who are a threat to our society. Jail is necessary for people who are out of control and there's a good chance they're going to hurt other people. We're also, we think, moving in the right direction to try and find more ways to divert people out of having to go to jail. In some cases, that can be bail supervision programs, things like the Behavioral Treatment Foundation, where people that have a substance abuse issue can try and get resolution. If they can take care of those things, maybe they can avoid going to jail for what they've done, as long as society can have some security that they're not going to do it again. We've got a drug treatment court pilot going on right now. Many times it's sexually exploited women who have drug issues that tie in with the abuse they may have suffered, the other issues that may have put them out on the street. We're trying through the drug treatment court to take people like that, to get them the treatment, get them the other services they need, because if we can deal with the underlying problems, maybe they won't be committing the crimes. We're trying to divert people through restorative justice, to have communities actually step up, and instead of it being a judge doing the best they can, but 8 months after the fact or 3 months after the fact, giving the finger wag in the lecture, maybe it's actually more effective, and maybe it's actually tougher to have the accused person take responsibility for what they've done in front of their community. And sometimes even, the victim's willing, in front of their victim. And maybe the victim and community should work with the offender to come up with what the meaningful consequence should be. So I'm hopeful those are the kinds of things we can keep working on. We want meaningful consequences. And again, when people do dangerous things, when people threaten our society, there is a place for jails. Maybe, though, when there's other things that we can do to prevent risk to the community, maybe there's some smarter things that we can do in future to try and divert more people from the system. That's certainly one of the goals. So you've heard from the Attorney General. He's kind of a dull guy. You've heard from the Minister of Justice. He's a pretty cool guy. On what those different roles are. I know I've gotten off on a couple of different stories, but hopefully that gives you some idea of the way those roles can be compatible if our systems are working the way you'd like it to be, but also how sometimes on any given day, even as I'm speaking in question period or answering a question in the hall afterwards, those two voices are sometimes in conflict, and I've always got to remember that when it comes to preserving the integrity of our system, to preserving the independence of our judges, to preserving the rights of accused people, the Attorney General, even though he may not be that cool, is actually going to win out in a lot of those cases. Sometimes there's a price for that. Sometimes that means that people aren't satisfied with the resolution in court. But what's the benefit? The benefit is protecting the system of law, that even though it has its problems from time to time, a system of law that actually is the foundation for a lot of the freedoms that we take for granted in this country and the freedoms we take for granted in this province. So I stand before you as Attorney General and Minister of Justice. You'll hear the Minister of Justice talking a lot about being tough on crime. You'll hear the Minister of Justice as well talking about all the other things that we can do to prevent crime in our communities, the things we can do to try and deal with people who've committed crimes. You'll also hear the Attorney General once in a while, although usually the Attorney General's comments get left on the cutting room floor when the media edits their stories at the end of the day. So I will turn it back to Donna, and then we'll be happy to try and answer some questions.